Right, we are recording.
Thank you, Viv. Well, welcome to Back to Basics with Type Dynamics with Yvonne Nelson-Reid. I'd just like to say that the BAPT board are delighted that this session is sponsored by the Foundation. We greatly appreciate support from the Myers Briggs Foundation, and you can access further information about them by clicking on the link to their website beside this session's information on the conference website. Most of you probably know Yvonne is a depth psychologist and MBTI Master Practitioner in Research and Development at Myers Briggs Foundation. She oversees all development and training for the MMTIC instrument and is editor of PeopleStripes. Yvonne's suggesting that if you've got questions during her presentation, you could put them in the chat or comments, and there'll be time at the end to look through and discuss it all. So thank you, Yvonne.
Wonderful. Thank you, Isabel. And so great to see all of you. I've got 3 screens, so if I look like I'm looking away, I've got you on one screen. So I'm trying to look at you as well as the presentation. So just delighted to be here with all of you, and great to see some familiar faces and some new faces too. So thank you for the introduction, Isabel. And I just want to welcome everyone to Back to Basics with Type Dynamics. You know, when the call for proposals came out, I remember reading something about, trying to do some sessions that might be for new people, coming into the type field and interest, but we also have people who are very experts in the type industry. So it's kind of hard to develop a presentation that covers it all. So I hope I've done that. That's been my intent. All right, so let's go ahead and just get started. So I want to start by just telling you a little bit about myself. Some of you know me, but I was thinking about it. I've presented at a few conferences over the past couple of years, and I don't know if I've actually shared my background, and I thought it might be helpful if you knew a little bit more about me. So psychological type's been a big part of my life now for over 30 years, used it personally, professionally, academically. I have a master's and a PhD in depth psychology, looking at Jungian and archetypal studies. I also did a master's way back in like the late 90s on Jungian theory. So Jung has certainly been a part of my life for a long time. And at that point in time, I actually did a lot of my thesis was actually on the MBTI assessment. So that was very exciting for me. And in order to use that assessment, I needed to be certified. So I attended the MBTI qualifying program through Psychometrics Canada in the mid-90s. And I remember sitting in that session thinking about how much I'd love to one day do these trainings. Well, 20 years later, I got the opportunity. So that was very exciting for me. So I currently work at Myers Briggs Foundation in their research and development department, working with both MBTI and MMTIC systems. So of course, no surprise, I'm focusing on the MBTI model with this presentation. I'm editor, lead writer at PeopleStripes, as Isabel mentioned, and that's the home of the MMTIC assessment, so the Murphy-Meisgeier type indicator for children assessment. And PeopleStripes is actually part of Myers Briggs Foundation. Not many people know that. I'm on the MBTI certification program faculty for both the US and Canada. And my most recent adventure, which has been so much fun, is I'm now teaching at Pacifica Graduate Institute their course on psychological types. So great fun with that. Well, I am presenting to you today on behalf of Myers Briggs Foundation. You can see all the branding. So yes, that's why I'm here. And not everybody is familiar with the foundation. So the foundation itself is a nonprofit organization, and it's charged with the ethical application of the Myers Briggs type indicator assessment and the depth of knowledge that accompanies it. So the spirit and intellectual legacy of Myers Briggs Foundation is grounded in C.G. Jung's theory of psychological types, which, as we all know, grew exponentially with Isabel Briggs Myers' achievements with the MBTI assessment, and became established through the Center for Applications of Psychological Type, CAPT. Many people are familiar and remember CAPT. And CAPT is the nonprofit that was started by Myers and Mary McCauley back in 1975. And that existed up until last year. so 2023. And that is when CAPT merged with Myers Briggs Foundation. So Myers Briggs Foundation has always been a supporting organization for CAPT. So the merger just seemed like a natural next step. It just made sense. So the legacy of CAPT is still carried forward, only now it's through Myers Briggs Foundation. Today, the foundation holds and builds on the legacy of Young, Briggs, Myers, Macaulay, and CAPT through research, education, and community. I love this quote, and I know we see it all the time. It's so popular, but I still absolutely love it. Isabel concluded her book, Gifts Differing, with the following statement: whatever the circumstances of your life, whatever your personal ties, work, responsibilities, the understanding of type can make your perceptions clear, your judgments sounder, and your life closer to your heart's desire. We at Myers Briggs Foundation are carrying her dream forward every day, and I am honored to be a part of that journey. So let's get into the presentation, type dynamics and development. So one thing I picked up on yesterday, and no surprise, several type practitioners and coaches are attending this conference. Makes sense. But it got me really thinking about how we so often do for others, but how often do we reflect on ourselves? Yesterday, both Sharon and Catherine spoke about the importance of type application when working with clients, but it's also important for us to remember this for ourselves. Personal experience speaking. One area Sharon brought up was type and stress or anxiety, and how many of her clients are eager to better understand how to manage stress in their lives. And I found the same with many of my clients. I have my own practice as well. So think about what we've all been through over the past few years. Sharon mentioned the pandemic. We're currently dealing with inflation. John yesterday talked about climate change. There's war happening overseas. It's an election year in the US, which adds to the stress and anxiety that many of us in the US feel. These are all collective stressors, but we each have individual stressors in our lives too. I was in a breakout room with Carmel yesterday during Catherine's presentation, and we were talking about our mobilizer interaction style. Now, I'm not as familiar with I know them, but I don't use them every day. And I had a hard time relating to the conflict action of fight, compete, which really got me thinking about myself. So years ago, that was probably me. What's changed? As we know, people are complex, we're multifaceted. We also know that type is just part of who we are. It's an important part, of course. That's why we're all here. And although considered innate, okay, our personality types are also influenced by our environment, family, culture. Susan Nash spoke about that just in the previous session. And life experiences, which all impact how we might express our type preferences. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with or use the MBTI Step 2 assessment. I love it. It looks at our out of preference facets and is a wonderful tool for exploring what influences in our lives may have pushed us to develop in opposite ways to our innate type preferences. And these facets can change over our lifespan, reflecting these life changes as well as our type development. Type is developmental. What I love about doing a Step 2 feedback session are the rich stories that are shared and the insights clients come away with. It's truly a remarkable coaching experience. I find it the same way when I get into type dynamics and development. Rich stories and many insights, but it's also a complicated system, and that can be hard when working with a client as well. So this presentation is geared towards those of you who may be new to type, but I hope that it'll also provide an opportunity for experienced type practitioners to revisit some key concepts and explore further your own type development. So take some time for you today. Let me start with just a simple definition of type dynamics, we're all familiar with. Type dynamics is the interaction of the four preferences within the types, and that results in a dynamic personality. I want to just visit Young for a second. Jung provided general descriptions of his 8 types in Psychological Types Collected Works, Volume 6, but to him, this wasn't the essential content in his book. Rather than a system of classification, which he saw as a childish parlor game, he saw his typology as a critical psychology, dealing with the organization and delimitations of psychic processes that can be shown to be typical, but are not meant to be used as labels. So for him, it was about understanding your personal equation, your relationship to conscious and unconscious contents in the psyche. Jung saw all 8 types as potentialities in all of us, but believed the dominant function takes most of our psychic energy, thus leaving the others often undeveloped and unconscious. He was really most interested in the inferior function and its relationship to the unconscious. He wrote for the clinician. Really, he was writing for the academic. So thankfully, in comes Isabel Briggs Myers and her mother, Catherine. It was through the innovative addition of JP preference pair that the 16 MBTI personality types were formed. The MBTI assessment, interactive feedback for verification, the 4-letter type code helped to make Jung's theories accessible to all people. And of course, this is all thanks to Myers and the work that she did. So with the ingenious creation of the 4-letter type code, Myers was able to provide a system for identifying type dynamics, determining which mental processes are extroverted, which ones are introverted, the order in which we access them, their typical development for each type. So I want to just give you an overview because I know many of you are very familiar with this model, but I also don't want to leave anyone behind who maybe this is fairly new for them. So here's an example of what this would look like for someone with ENFJ preferences. Those are my preferences. So we begin with the dominant process. This receives the most energy. This is what is relied on most, considered the core of the personality. It's what's often most conscious and developed. We call it the superhero. So it's kind of the superhero of your personality. But we would be pretty one-sided and out of balance if that's where we left things. So we have the auxiliary process, which supports and provides balance to the dominant. So think of it as your sidekick, the sidekick to your superhero. They work together. And of course, this is what often develops in that first half of life. And these are the 2 middle letters in our type code. So we see those. But what we don't see are the other processes as well. So the tertiary process, for example, it's not one of the preferred processes, so it's not in our type code. It's opposite to the auxiliary, less developed and conscious than the first 2. And lastly, and one we're all many of us are very familiar with, is the inferior process. It receives the least energy and attention. It's usually the least developed and may come across as childish, likely explored during and after midlife, along with the tertiary process. So the creation of the type code to represent type dynamics was quite a feat, and Myers isn't always given credit for it. Anytime the 4-letter type code is used, it's Myers's work, not Jung's, although it's often credited to Jung. So if you're new to type and don't know the type dynamics of your MBTI personality type, don't worry. There's a handout that's on the main website. Isabel's also going to put it in chat, and it just gives you a brief breakdown of the 8 dominant types, very brief. But there's also whole type included. So if you could just look for your whole type, you'll be able to see where everything else fits in for you. So what is good type development? Okay, we know that type is developmental, right? We were born, these processes are innate, preferences are innate, according to theory, but they develop over our lifespan. So what does it look like with good type development? Well, Isabel Briggs Myers in Gifts Differing writes this: by the time individuals have full control of their dominant and auxiliary processes, they know their strengths and they use them expertly. I don't know if they use, I'd like to think that, but I don't know if that always happens. If they can then learn to use an opposite when it's more appropriate, then the best developed processes, they can become adequately skilled in its use, and when needed, can cross over from the natural to what is appropriate. So exploring type dynamics and development with my clients is incredibly rewarding work. It can help with verification of best fit type. And since type is developmental, I find it particularly helpful in my work with young people and those entering into the second half of life. Understanding type dynamics has been helpful in raising my own children. I have 5 of them. And in better understanding how stress over the past few years in particular has affected each one of us. So questions for you to consider. Where are you in your type development? I want you focusing on you now. How do you express your preferences? How comfortable are you in using your opposite mental processes? Even those of us who have worked with type for decades can be caught off guard. And I'll be sharing some stories with you that actually demonstrate that. So for the rest of the session, so that's kind of all the background. What I want to look at now is dominant type, what it looks like on a good day. I want you to think about how it helps you and how it might not help you, and what happens when you're under stress. I'll be sharing brief descriptions, but the focus is going to be on storytelling. I will share stories, and I want you to do the same. So you're going to have an opportunity to go into breakout rooms where I hope you'll be able to share your stories with each other. So beginning with the 8 dominant functions, the perceiving mental processes. On a good day, we naturally lean into our dominant and auxiliary processes. It's here where we tend to feel the most comfortable and competent. Although I'm focusing on dominant type, you may also relate to the descriptions that speak to your auxiliary process. So as we mature, we become more comfortable using our opposite preferences. Or you might be working on the development of the other processes through type awareness. Maybe life circumstances, traumas, world events have shifted your focus of energy. We are all influenced by our outside environment. So think about your own dominant process. How does it help you? How does it not help you? And again, you'll be going to breakout groups to share stories about how that fits for you. And again, there's a handout that will help guide you with that. So I want to go through the perceiving mental processes first. You're going to see an incredibly brief description. There are books, there are chapters that give so much more information on each of the dominant processes. But what I'm trying to do here with you is give you some key words, some key terms that can help make it easier to call up quickly, and also to provide a language that you can use when talking to someone with those preferences. So extroverted sensing, ESTP, ESFP, hold tight. They like to experience the world. So the key word is experience. They live in the here and now. Introverted sensing, that's hold tight, ISTJ, ISFJ preferences. It's really about trusting and remembering the past. That's what they count on. That's what they lean into, especially details that are important to them. Extroverted intuition. This relates to ENFP and ENTP preferences. This is about being enthusiastic and enjoying brainstorming, keyword brainstorming. So when I'm speaking to someone with these preferences, I will try to bring in those words. If I don't know someone's type, then I may need to pull a few of these words out when I'm communicating with them. And the last of the perceiving mental processes, introverted intuition. That's INFJ, INTJ preferences. And this is about trusting and relying on inner insights and visions. So I mentioned to you this was going to be about storytelling, but I need to give you just a very brief guide on what each of these dominant types looks like. Again, a very simplified way. It's much deeper and more complex than what is shared here on the screen. So let me give you an example. My oldest daughter prefers ISFJ. That's introverted sensing. So that's the second one here on the list. She performs in musical theater, and she can still recite lines from plays she performed years ago. For me, that's always mind-boggling. I can hardly remember what I did yesterday. When something is important to her, she remembers it well. This is her strength. Now, how might that hinder her? Well, she expects everybody else to remember too. And when we don't, she's very disappointed and lets you know. She had an experience with a boss, I think it was her second professional career. And during one of the meetings, her boss, who we suspect prefers extroverted intuition, so possibilities, her boss would brainstorm multiple ideas and possibilities during a meeting. And my daughter would be taking notes, taking in everything literal, just writing it all down. And she was constantly overwhelmed at work. And she would make sure that she stayed up late and did everything that was listed on the task list in her mind. And she'd go into work the next day and her boss would be like, "What are you doing? I didn't tell you to do these things. Why did you do that? Why did you do this?" And she tried talking to her boss about it. We talked about type, of course, because my kids have all grown up with it. And she just ended up actually leaving that job after only 3 months because she just struggled with communication in that way. Let's turn to the judging mental processes. What do those look like? So for extroverted thinking, that's ESTJ, ENTJ preferences. It's about organizing the environment logically for greater efficiency. Introverted thinking, ISTP, INTP preferences. About analyzing internal ideas. So this is all happening internally, looking at pros and cons back and forth. Extroverted feeling, ESFJ, ENFJ. This is about seeking harmony with and between people. And the last one here is introverted feeling, ISFP, INFP preferences. This is about considering their internal value system. So again, we know what happens when it's extroverted and when it's introverted. So very brief keywords, brief descriptions, just to give you a guide when it comes to communicating with people who may have a different dominant type than you. Another story. So I prefer ENFJ. That's the third one on this list, extroverted feeling. Well, one of my strengths is having compassion for others and being supportive. So I'm always there for my kids, eager to help them through their troubles, no matter what time of day it is. Where this hinders me is when I give so much that there's nothing left for me, which can lead to resentment if I don't catch it in time. So dominant type represents our natural strengths. It's where we feel the most competent and comfortable. So before you go into breakout, I actually want to jump into looking at a little bit of type and stress so that you can bring that into your conversations as well. But let's look at just everyday stress. Okay, so everyday stress, what does that look like? Type dynamics can help us identify the form of our stress reactions, how we experience stress, the way our preferences are expressed when we're stressed. In fact, really, it's more about how they look, and then what may trigger them. And I highly recommend Naomi's books, In the Grip, Was That Really Me? Naomi Quink's books. Great if you're interested in type and stress. So when faced with everyday stress, these are things like you're running late for a meeting. Maybe you're at work, you get a call from the school, you have a sick child who needs to be picked up. So in these moments, we tend to lean more into our dominant process because that's where we feel the most comfortable and the most competent. So we put most of our energy there. As a result, however, we tend to lose balance with our auxiliary process. So the dominant process becomes exaggerated. It's like it becomes inflated. It's almost like we become caricatures of our best selves. the psyche becomes one-sided. For people who prefer extroversion, you can see it. Their type exaggeration is outward, on display for everyone to see. For those who prefer introversion, well, they tend to withdraw and they turn that exaggeration inward. So let's just look at a few brief descriptions of what this looks like. So what does each dominant function look like when exaggerated or overused? Extroverted sensing. This is again ESTP, ESFP. They become overindulgent, become hyperactive, right? So where they're naturally good at enjoying their sensory world, they now begin to overuse it. They indulge their senses with maybe overeating, over drinking. There are often active people who like adventure. When it gets exaggerated, they may become hyperactive. Introverted sensing. They naturally have excellent recall for specifics. And now, once they get that exaggerated under stress, they may begin to obsess about unimportant information and they withdraw from even more. Extroverted intuition. They like brainstorming possibilities. Well, now they become obsessed with too many possibilities. Introverted intuition. They're often visionary folks. Now they may have wild visions and they may fall prey to unconscious images. So a story to share for this slide. I have another daughter who has preferences for INTJ. So that here is the last one on the slide. When under everyday stress, she turns even more inward and withdraws. And her night dreams come through to her as almost a reality. In the morning, she'll wake up and she'll start sharing a dream like, Mom, did this happen? Is this going on? I'm worried. And it's just, she's really leaning into that introverted intuition that is normally a gift. And now it becomes inflated, overblown, overused. And she can even imagine that there are others, people are kind of out to get her. She can become somewhat paranoid and read into situations more than what's actually there. So let's look at the last four, exaggerated. So extroverted thinking. Here, they're naturally good at organizing the environment logically for efficiency. Now they may become bossy. They may over-organize. So they'll come across as detached, cold, and maybe overly rational. Introverted thinking. This is really, they're naturally critical, okay? But now they become hypercritical. And they're only seeing the cons. And they like to find out the truth. They search for that, but now they might obsessively begin searching and they want to know the truth about everything. Extroverted feeling, naturally encouraging, but now they become insistent that they know what is best. They can become intrusive. They seek harmony, but when exaggerated, they tend to deny problems for the sake of a superficial harmony. Introverted feeling. They naturally care for others and themselves. They can withdraw into a kind of a pity party, a pool of pity, carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. They're typically sensitive, but now they might become hypersensitive. So a story here to share with you. A client of mine could always tell when her boss was under stress because the boss would start barking orders at everyone. So the boss had a preference for extroverted thinking. So what I would like to do, and I'll open it up to questions first if you have any, but I'd like you to go into a breakout room. Let me see what time it is. A breakout room so that you can talk about your dominant process, how it helps you, how it might hinder you, and maybe share a story if you find that you've overused it at times and what might that look like. And I think if we do, you're going to be in small groups. So I think if we do 5 minutes, we should be okay with that. Any questions before you go into breakout? Go ahead and then share some of your own experiences. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a chance to chit chat and kind of, have some fun with some of your own personal stories, reflect on yourselves. And I'm going to dive into the last part of the session because I want you to have another breakout where you can share some stories here. And that is us looking at stress at even a deeper level. So what happens when we experience prolonged or extreme stress? So this is chronic stress, illness, fatigue, substance abuse, a death, job loss, divorce. These are all examples of prolonged or extreme stress. And this kind of stress tends to activate the inferior function. And what does that look like? And even those of us who've been in the type field forever can still be bit and become victims to that inferior function. So Young writes, inferiority in a function is often not so easy to recognize or to describe. An essential criterion is its lack of self-sufficiency, consequent dependence on people and circumstances, its disposing us to moods and crotchetiness, its unreliable use, its suggestible and label character. The inferior function always puts us at a disadvantage because we cannot direct it, but are rather its victims. In teaching my course at Pacifica, so many of the students at the very beginning of the class said, I use all the functions. I'm completely comfortable using them all. And I kind of smiled and said, okay, let's go through the process. Let's learn more about these. Let's get into the storytelling. And of course, by the end of the program, they were like, wow, this is definitely not what I was thinking. So our type preferences are so innate that even those of us who have worked in type for years, as I mentioned, can still become victims to the inferior function. I like this quote. I don't know how many of you have read von Franz. I like her work. She talks a lot about the inferior function, especially in her lectures on Jung's typology. And she writes, in examining the dynamic interplay between the functions, one must always recognize the hold that the superior or dominant function has on the inferior. The superior function, like an eagle seizing a mouse, tries to get hold of the inferior function and bring it over into its own realm. I love that line. I don't know, something about it really stands out for me. Because even when we are consciously trying to work with the inferior function, the dominant, because it takes so much energy, often tries to take the lead. So here's an example. I have a good friend of mine with INTJ preferences, and she was telling me how she accesses her inferior function of extroverted sensing through cooking. She loves to cook. She's really good at it. She described the process of searching for recipes, imaginative process for her, preparing a 5-course meal that when she prepared it, she said it would feed at least 10 people. The meal was just for her. It was as if extroverted sensing came through the imagination of her introverted intuition. For her, that was a mind-blowing conversation. And I remember I was at a Jungian conference in Seattle, and I remember talking to a Jungian psychologist with INTP preferences. And we're in the middle of the conversation, and he's like, stop, give me a minute. I have to call up my feeling preference. And I sat there for a moment and I thought, I don't ever have to call up my feeling preference. Let's see what's happening here. And it was so clear that he was bringing it up through his dominant introverted thinking function. So I want you to think about that. I actually want to do more research in this area because I wonder if so many of those other processes come through us are fed through the dominant. And when they're fed through the dominant, it shifts them a bit, kind of changes their flavor. Anyway, that's just a new interest of mine that I'd like to look into further. So the inferior function, let's go there. You'll notice the descriptions are similar to the exaggerated form of the opposite, okay? What is different is that with exaggeration, we tend to feel confident, inflated, right? We got this. Whereas with the grip reaction, it's often childish, either or thinking, and tends to feel out of character. In other words, we're more deflated. Consciousness gets clouded and the unconscious takes over. It's like someone else is in the driver's seat. Introverted types display the negative characteristics of their inferior function. We see it in action. They're not fans of that, but we see it. Extroverted types feel locked inside, so they become withdrawn and often depressed. So let's take a look at these. Extroverted sensing, that's for INFJ, INTJ type preferences, where they're naturally comfortable with the inner world of ideas and complex possibilities. In the grip, they obsess over details, frantically cleaning the house. They overindulge in their sensual pleasures. They are often verbal raving. They may even be out of control. Introverted sensing, passion for new ideas and possibilities. Typically, in the grip, they may withdraw, feel numb, depressed, tunnel vision. They may even imagine that they have physical symptoms or illnesses that actually aren't there. Extroverted intuition. Here, they naturally reflect on experiences and they trust them. But when they're in the grip, they lose control of those details and they begin to catastrophize the future. And they can become even impulsive because they aren't, using those details or facts in the way that they typically do as a strength. Introverted intuition, inferior. So they like to experience the environment. Okay. They're often carefree people, but in the grip, they can have fantasies of impending disaster and they can get into a spiral filled with frightening possibilities. So here's another story. This one's a little longer, but this shows where somebody with experience in the type field for many, many years still can fall victim to not being able to use type language in the way that I would want to use it. So we moved from Virginia, we lived there for many years, to Texas about 7 years ago. Our oldest was finishing her first year of college in Virginia and didn't want to move. It was hard leaving her, but I knew it had to be her choice. She visited over the holidays, really missed being with us. She called that February and said, "Hey, Mom, I think I want to move to Texas and transfer schools." Well, guess how I responded? Now, this is my daughter who prefers ISFJ, second one here on the list, introverted sensing. My response was with great enthusiasm, telling her about all the opportunities that are waiting here for her. I was using my auxiliary of introverted intuition, feeding it through extroverted feeling. There are lots of job opportunities, great schools, and I bet Mr. Wonderful lives just around the corner. Well, she snapped at me and hung up the phone. I was shocked. We're very close. And I'm like, what just happened? And immediately I went, aha, oh my gosh. By speaking to her through my type strength, I threw her into the grip of her inferior function. But it took me a second to think it through because it was just so natural for me to share my excitement. So remember, introverted sensing is all about remembering. It's about trusting past experience. But all I could talk about was future possibilities. So I called her back and I said, "Hey, can I start again?" This time I started with, "How do you feel about going to a new school that first year of college? What was that like for you?" She said she was scared, she was nervous. Well, how did that go? She said it was great. I met friends, wonderful friends, had great professors. So then my response back to her was, remember. So I use that key word that gets her attention. Remember, you've done it before, you can do it again. And that's all she needed to hear. I needed to speak her language. When using my language, I threw her into the grip of her inferior function. She moved, was very happy with the move, and in a town of 1.7 million people, Mr. Wonderful was indeed just around the corner. In fact, they've been married now for 2 years, and I said, Mama knows best, introverted intuition in action. Let's take a look at the last 4. Inferior extroverted thinking focuses on personal values, inner harmony is where they feel most comfortable and natural. In the grip, they judge others harshly, aggressive criticism. They're the finger pointers. Da, 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 da. Next is inferior introverted thinking. On a good day, they value harmony and good feelings, but in the grip, they begin to turn inward, condemning oneself and turning that criticism towards themselves. Inferior extroverted feeling. On a good day, they value objective analysis and may appear almost unfeeling, but in the grip, they're hypersensitive to emotional states. They drown in emotions. They're often tearful, and it's displayed outwardly, not a place they're comfortable with. And lastly, inferior introverted feeling. They value competence and being in control naturally, but in the grip, hypersensitive to inner emotional states. They try to hide it. They take on a martyr role, and they may shut down. Another story for you. This happened a couple years ago when we were playing board games with the family over the holidays. So there was myself, my husband, and our 5 kids, and 2 boyfriends were hanging out as well. And we were playing the game Taboo. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Your partner has to guess a word based on clues, but there are certain things you cannot say. And if you say the wrong thing, you get beeped. So there's this beeper, this buzzer that gets beeped. So my youngest and I were really good at the game. Well, it was my husband's turn with his partner. He kept saying the wrong words. And our middle child, who had the beeper, was quite happily beeping in his ear the entire time. And I could see his frustration building. And I was worried about what was going to happen next. Well, it happened. He prefers INFP. So for him, that's that first line on the slide. He's typically kind, caring, sensitive. He stood up and started yelling out curse words and that the game was ridiculous, blah, 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 and he stormed out of the room. It was silent at the table. I wondered what the boyfriends were thinking. Then one of the kids quietly said, "Hey, Mom, do you think Dad is in the grip?" And we all started to kind of giggle. I admit it, and under our breath, of course, because yes, indeed, he was in the grip. So after he cooled down, he came out, apologized, and we actually had a great conversation about personality type sitting around the table. So I want you to be able to share stories with each other. I'm going to go ahead and put you in a breakout as well. And I want you to think about your experience of your inferior process. What does it look like for you? Have you seen this act up for you? And what does that look like? So let's go ahead, Isabel. Unless there's any questions that I'm thinking with our group, you're probably good to just go right into storytelling. Questions first?
Could just go back, Yvonne, to the last one.
I sure
just
can.
to remind me. Okay. Yeah, got it.
Okay. You're welcome. All right, we're going to go for 7 minutes. Because I think we only got one more slide, I think, after. So let's give you about 7 minutes to share your stories about being in the grip of your inferior. I'll see you back soon. Oops. Welcome back. I know it's never enough time in breakout rooms, and I just made notes. If I do something like this again, I want to give you more time because I know how rich that is when you get to share with each other. And so I hope you were able to get something out of that together and to have some time for yourselves. So wrapping up, this is it. My goal really with this presentation was to reawaken for you the value of working with type dynamics and the importance of exploring type through the type development lens, not only for our clients, but for ourselves as well, to take that time to reflect back on our own process and how we're growing, developing, and so forth. So type dynamics and development, just to wrap it up, and then I'll open up for questions for the last couple minutes. It's the dynamic interaction between the preferences within a personality type And that's what makes the MBTI framework unique and an important part of understanding your MBTI results. MBTI type dynamics takes personality type to a whole new level of understanding and is invaluable in getting to know ourselves and others better. So I do try to take my clients to type dynamics. It's often not done in a first session, but certainly on a follow-up for sure. So thank you. Thank you, everybody. And I open it up for questions, comments. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody.
And Sharon has kindly, I mean, Yvonne, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
For me. Yvonne has kindly agreed to stay on a little while if you want to share any of what you've been experiencing while you've talked about these things.
I have a question. Yvonne,
Yes,
when
Lynn.
you said your daughter called and said, I for some reason I thought she was excited about moving to Texas and coming to another school. So I'm not quite sure how that. Yeah, I would have thought the response would have been to be excited too for her that, yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Well, thank you, Lynn, because that's actually a really good way to look at it. So yeah, she was excited in her version of excitement, which was different than my version of excitement. So for her, the excitement part was probably coming through her auxiliary, I suspect, of extroverted feeling. So wanting to be close and near family, missing being with all of us. And that's, I think, how she led it. And then when I followed suit with my dominant extroverted feeling and shared in with her excitement, and then led into all the great opportunities and possibilities, I think in that point, in that moment, I triggered her dominant introverted sensing, which flipped her into the inferior.
So would that be kind of thinking, oh, wait a minute, when I move, I'm going to have to worry about this and.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Exactly. Exactly. And, you know, and it really shows how it can be so complex, because whenever I do type dynamics, these are the kind of conversations I have. And this is what I love about them. Like, well, because it's not so simple, right? All of our processes work together. You can't just pull them out and do one by itself. And that's why I'm interested in looking more at how do our other processes show up, right? Are they coming through our dominant? I mean, I don't know. Would he think that? Perhaps. I mean, in his mind, I think based on his writings, we don't even have access to them. Yeah, they're there, but they're so unconscious. So I don't know. Thank you.
Because I was kind of taught that when you're so stressed, when you get into the grip, your brain can't even get back to where your dominant side is.
Exactly. And one of the ways of doing that is, when people say just get over yourself, that they're really saying get out of your inferior and get back to your dominant, because we like you better there. And, we know that to do that, that's not easy, because if we could, we would.
Yeah.
So it's more about working up in stages. And so what I'll often tell people, I say, okay, let's, you're from that inferior position. Let's look at tertiary. What do you need in that tertiary function? And then once they get that level, then you can bump up into the auxiliary. And then once they get there, it's a much easier leap then to the dominant. So it's too far of a leap otherwise.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. You're welcome.
So Yvonne,
Hi,
this is just kind of a funny question I've been pondering for a while, because I look at type dynamics and type development, and then I also hear people say, well, look, type never changes. I'm like, well, development and dynamics both seem pretty change oriented. But my question is a little pivot from that, is when we talk about type dynamics, I mean, you're talking about taking the basic dichotomies and then getting to these functions. It almost seems like in a Hillman way, like you could flip it the other way and be like, the functional structure of the psyche is the fundamental piece. And type statics is kind of what happens when you split people into introverts and extroverts and thinkers and judgers.
Yeah.
I like it. That's what I was looking for. I just wanted that. Yes.
No, I love that. And I love the idea. Of course, Hillman, of course, right? Likes to
Yeah.
flip things to the opposite, flip it back, which I love. I love that kind of imaginative thinking. But yeah, it's true, isn't it? How, what is our perspective? What do we lean on? And we say, we don't want to label people as judgers and perceivers and all of that, but yet so many systems out there do that. And I think the idea is to recognize that everything works together and filters through itself. Let's face it, the psyche isn't, it's always in movement, right? Always seeking that balance.
Yeah. And it seems like, we want to kind of ease people. Myers Briggs wanted to ease people in, like, okay, like how simple can we make this? Okay, like thinkers on one side, feelers. And it's a good start. It's probably still a good start for people who haven't spent 30 years on it. But it's got its own flaws and limitations as well.
David, and that's such a great point, because when Isabel first started working on this, she was actually not working on a step 1. She was actually working on a step 3 assessment, right? So it was much more in depth, much more involved. And of course, to produce something that people will actually use and understand, you simplify it and bring it down. But the problem is that people get stuck there. And that, when I do the certification programs, like I let people know right from the start, okay, I need to do this, right? We need to go to the fundamentals. However, don't stay there. Please don't stay there. And the next level is that, go to type dynamics, because there you're going to see the fluidity. You'll see that it's not that static, and just how we can trigger each other. Things we say, things we do can trigger one another, a different function that comes through. And so for me, it's step 2. That assessment shows where type development is actually taking place. And that's through the facets. There's 20 facets, and it can show where, you're out of preference, in preference, and that can shift throughout your life. So great point, right? Is type, do we change? The idea, the theory is that our 4-letter type doesn't change, right? But does it? Maybe. I don't know. And I know what does change is how well we use it. My kids now call me bold and direct. Nobody would ever have called me bold and direct 25 years ago. So that feels comfortable for me. But I also have a questioning, which is on the thinking side, out of preference facet as well. So, I can come across very different than other people with ENFJ preferences, which I think the step 2 really highlights and shows. And the step 3, which actually doesn't follow suit, like it's not like it's a progression or an order. The step 3 needs a lot of work and development, and we're getting to it. It's more of a coaching tool, but it's a coaching tool that looks at type development. And that's really what Isabel was interested in, was development. Yeah. And I've just learned that through working at the foundation mostly, getting more of that backstory. We have all her archives, and we just received all of Naomi Quank's archives, and we have all the tapes of her past presentation. I'm just like, it's like this little gold mine, especially with the step 2, which I may do a presentation on down the road, because it's so much deeper than we realize, out there. So anyway, thank you, David. Thank you.
I'm going to suggest that stop recording this now, and thank you very much, Yvonne, for your for the presentation, which is